Welcome to this important webinar, which will be exploring the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, what to watch out for, and what needs to happen in 2025. This webinar is brought to you by the Loss and Damage Collaboration, Satat Sampada Foundation, Climate Foundation, the Heinrich Böll, Stiff Tongue Washington, D.C. office, Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, the Center for International Environmental Law, ACE Observatory, the YOUNGO Loss and Damage Working Group, and the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. Today, we're going to be talking about what was achieved by the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage to date, what will happen in 2025 on the fund, and what we need to see, what will happen at the fifth board meeting of the fund, which is starting next week on Tuesday in Barbados, and what the key issues will be during that meeting. We'll also talk about what will happen at the high-level dialogue, which will be convened by the fund, which will happen towards the end of April. And importantly, we'll talk about what you can do this year to help with the work around the fund before having time to answer your questions. Before we get started, there are a couple of house rules. You'll find that you can enable closed captions in your Zoom menu by clicking the Show Captions button. Unfortunately, they're only going to be available in English. We're going to be sharing the slideshow in the chat. This will be useful because there are several links throughout the slides which you'll be able to access. You'll be able to follow in real time, and you'll be able to use it as a resource afterwards. For the chat, please do tell us where you're coming from, which organization, and who you are. Also use the chat for any comments or thoughts that you want to share throughout. And for questions, please do raise a hand during the Q&A section. You can ask questions in the chat also, but just make sure that we don't lose them if they're higher up in the chat. When you are asking questions with a hand up, please do keep your questions short. We prefer questions rather than lengthy statements, just so that we can make sure to get through all of as many questions as possible. Now, just before we begin, we just wanted to provide a little bit of a reminder, set a context of why we're here. Since 2023, Earth's average temperatures have been at least 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And a recent World Meteorological Organization report on 2024, which is the hottest year on record, lays bare the devastating loss and damage the climate crisis is already causing. The report highlights that there were 151 unprecedented extreme weather events, and more than 800,000 people were displaced and made homeless. The historic decision to set up the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage came after a 30-year delay due to developed countries blocking progress on addressing loss and damage. With the fund now institutionally set up, this webinar looks at what needs to happen in 2025 to ensure that a fit-for-purpose fund starts to deliver urgently needed loss and damage finance to countries and communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. And in this first section, we're going to hear from Harjeet Singh on what was achieved to date by the fund. Over to you, Harjeet.
Thank you, Theo, and thank you everybody for joining this very important conversation ahead of the fifth board meeting. And we'll now cover what has happened so far. Next slide, please. We're going to go a little bit faster. So because Theo, as Theo said, we've already shared the presentation and we would like to keep good amount of time for the conversation later. So in terms of milestones, please keep yourself on mute. So in terms of milestones, we know that the executive director was selected late last year. His name is Ibrahima Sheikh Diong, and he has now moved to the US. And we also selected the host country, that's the Philippines, where we'll be hosting 1 to 2 meetings every year. We also saw the board confirming World Bank as the interim host for 4 years. Which, as you know, was quite a controversial decision. There were a lot of advocacy efforts to, one, make sure that World Bank doesn't become the host. And now that it has, there have been several conditions that have been put. And while declaring World Bank only as an interim host, and it is hosting something called Financial Intermediary Fund, which is a process through which World Bank is going to manage the money and host the secretariat, but not having any power to influence the decision. So in terms of money, it would rather act just like a bank without any powers to sign the check. That power remains with the board. And that's an important distinction that we need to understand, that while World Bank is there, it should not be allowed, and it does not have any power to influence who gets the money and in what form and how much. Next slide, please. In terms of pledges, we know that we had quite a bit of success at COP28 in initiating the process of receiving money, and we got some money at COP29 as well. So as we stand, $765.59 million have been pledged, and only of this, and after the pledging, the next step is to sign the contribution agreements. So only about $470 million worth of agreements have been signed, and the secretariat or the fund has only received $261 million, which is quite concerning. Of course, we know that the scale of the money that is required is running into hundreds of billions of dollars and potentially touching $1 trillion annually. And you have this paper. Again, the presentation is there. We'll be sharing it again. So this link to the paper done by Loss and Damage Collaboration and Heinrich Böll, Stiftung, Washington, where the estimate is that we need at least $400 billion annually this year. And we know, as I said, the demands are going to be only increasing as temperatures increase and climate impacts intensify. There's another analysis which talks about quite close to similar amount that we require in 2025. So we need hundreds of billions of dollars annually, whereas what has been pledged so far doesn't even touch $1 billion. So it's literally a drop in the ocean. And that's the kind of scale we have at this moment, which means a lot of efforts are going to be required to make sure that fund reaches that scale. Next slide, please. So some of the key decisions that have been taken. So far, we've had 4 board meetings. So last year, the 5th one this year is the first board meeting, and we are going to have 3 board meetings this year. And in the previous board meeting, it has approved additional rules of procedure where a lot of details have been agreed in terms of how board meetings are going to be conducted, the frequency, and how documents are going to be released and shared, role of alternate board members and advisors, which wasn't an easy decision to be taken, but that has been resolved. Travel policy may sound like just a simple document, but again, it took quite a bit of discussion to arrive at that, taking into account that the Green Climate Fund still does not have a travel policy, even after being in operation for several years. So it was quite an achievement to make sure that the funding support is provided to not only members and alternates, but also advisors to attend the meeting. In terms of observer participation, we are still having only interim procedures agreed. So we are going to the 5th board meeting with the same process that was agreed in the first board meeting, and it has been continuing, where we do now have 5 members from each constituency. We have 9 constituencies who can participate, but only 1 member is allowed in the room to act like an active observer. Not officially, but that's the mandate that we take when we are in the room. And another decision that was taken at the last board meeting is to allow the accredited organizations who are part of Green Climate Fund or Adaptation Fund to be approved in a blanket approach. More details are going to be worked out, which Secretariat is right now working on, and we will get to know more about it in this board meeting. Another thing that has happened so far, which is quite remarkable, the space that we have got as civil society, starting with the transitional committee, recognizing what civil society has done to bring this fund in as a reality. We always have a civil society dialogue at each meeting, and beyond that, we also get time to respond to some of the decision-making process that happens as active observers. There's also a decision on the transition plan and budget. And now is the time when the shift has been made almost from interim secretariat to the independent secretariat now that the executive director is there. So as you know, so far, it's Green Climate Fund and other UN agencies have been supporting, and a board work plan with a 2-year startup phase, and we'll talk more about the startup phase, has also been agreed. So a lot of work has happened so far. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll talk more about it, and I'm now going to hand over back to Theo. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. And we're actually going to hand over to Lien now, who's going to talk about what will happen in 2025.
Thank you, Theo, and thank you, Harjeet, for starting us off. Hi, everyone. I'm Lien. I'm with the Center for International Environmental Law, and I will run us through what is going to happen in 2025, both in terms of what the board is going to be discussing and hopefully deciding, and in terms of what we as civil society want to achieve within those decisions. Next slide, please. So first, some logistics. So this year there will be 3 board meetings. The 5th board meeting is the one that will happen next week. So that's the first one this year, and then there will be another meeting in July and a meeting in October. Both of those meetings will be in the Philippines, and the next meeting, the meeting next week, will be in Barbados. And on top of those 3 board meetings, there will also be a high-level dialogue on coordination and complementarity, which was also mandated by the governing instrument decision on the fund. And Brenda will talk more about that, so I will not go into detail now. And so the key decisions that are expected in those 3 board meetings are listed on the slide, starting with a decision on a startup phase for the fund. So key modalities and procedures for that startup phase are under discussion and partial decision next week at B5, and then further details are expected in the subsequent meetings. And so that's really a startup phase for early interventions for the fund that will run this year and next year. And the idea is really to start dispersing money and implementing activities as early as the beginning of 2026. Another decision that is really important to us is a decision on active observers. Harjeet already mentioned how things are running now, but that's really an informal understanding of how people that are observing the meetings can from time to time enter the room and come in on certain topics. We really want to formalize those ways of working, and we want I will go into more details later on what we exactly want from those rules. And then another participation modality that was mandated by the governing instrument is consultative forums, which is also it's unclear what those will entail, but the idea is to have either thematic or geographical, all to be decided, fora where stakeholders and rights holders can come in and inform the board's decision making and board's planning. So the idea is that it will contribute to meaningful participation, but the whole decision is still to be discussed and taken, and that will happen at the board meeting in July, according to the plan. Then other discussions that are happening are more related to the long-term operational plan, so really getting the fund fully up and running, and they relate to the access modalities and financial instruments. Access modalities is really about who has access to the fund, and so who implements the activities of the fund. I won't go into too much detail there, but it's about, do you have big implementing agencies? Do you have countries directly implementing activities? And there, within that bucket of work, there is, of course, the important civil society demand to ensure that the fund focuses on community access and really making sure that communities can have direct access to the funding. And the conversations on financial instruments relate to our main demand of, we've been asking that the fund would be fully grants-based. The governing instrument lists other financial instruments as well, that, are, going beyond grants-based finance, thinking of risk insurance, risk pooling mechanisms, insurance mechanisms, other highly concessional loans. And so that's really an important discussion also, because we are really convinced that, and we really have good arguments to say that this fund should be fully grants-based. Those decisions are also expected more at the second half of this year, so not at the meeting next week. And then really, really important is, of course, that the resource mobilization strategy has to be decided by the end of the year to really, as Harjeet was saying, up the scale of the funding that the fund can actually disperse. And then one point I will also quickly mention is that every year the board is supposed to report back to the COP, and then the COP takes, adopts that decision, and that is an opportunity for the COP to also give guidance back to the board. So at COP 30, there will be a discussion, hopefully, on what that guidance should look like, and there is an opportunity also beforehand to submit views on that. Unfortunately, it's only open to parties, but we can definitely try and work to influence those positions. Next slide, please. So this is very high level what we want to see. So what are the civil society demands for all of those decisions that I've just listed? I will go more in detail on the startup phase when I talk about the agenda of B5, but in short, we want a startup phase that is inclusive, that is community-led, that is equitable, that is human rights aligned, meaning that it prioritizes those that are on the front lines in vulnerable situations, experiencing marginalization, but also that the activities and that the fund in general avoids harm. I'll speak more to that later. With the participation policies, of course, we want meaningful participation of rights holders. Thinking about the active observer policy, for example, that means that we want board seats for indigenous peoples, for women and gender, for youth and children, and for environmental NGOs, which is also what is listed in the governing instrument. And we also see a role for affected communities to really participate in the decision-making of the board. And that also means that there should be no undue influence, for example, by the private sector. And so there should be no private sector active observer seat, which is what is in the current proposal that is yet to be discussed by the board. But that's really something that we see as totally inappropriate and also not in line with the governing instrument. In terms of access modalities, as I already mentioned before, I mean, there's many things that can be said about that. I think the main thing for civil society for us is really that this fund needs to focus on community access. That's something that we've said from the start. There was a lot of traction around it also in the transitional committee already. There is some mentions to small grants and these modalities in the governing instrument. And we really want community access modalities to be mainstreamed across, so thinking of all the types of modalities that the fund would be implementing, even if it's going directly to governments, if it's programmatic approaches, if it's through implementing agencies, there should be clear community access modalities, but then also a dedicated mechanism that is focusing on community access, so that has the simplified procedures in place to make sure that communities can directly access the funding, and a growing share of the money that is dedicated for community access within the fund. Then I already mentioned our demand for an exclusive focus on grants-based finance. And then, of course, there is an urgent need for more pledges, also for those pledges to be converted into real money that the fund can actually use. And then an ambitious resource mobilization strategy, which will be really something I think that we all have to, as civil society, converge around once they start discussing this to make sure that it is not just a fund that will rely on voluntary pledges, because we know from experience that that means it will be underfunded. Next slide, please. So now I will talk about next week's board meeting. So what is on the agenda, and also, again, what we want to achieve during that meeting. Next slide, please. So the agenda is online, and we've listed the main points here on the slide. There's several things that are being discussed. Status of resources, it's a recurring thing. There is a proposal from the co-chairs about how to decision making, basically what to do when there is no consensus. Should we vote? What should we do? There is the follow-up of that guidance that I mentioned that will happen at COP30. It also happened at COP29, so the board needs to follow up on that, even though there was not a lot of very strong guidance given by COP29. They still need to do some follow-up. And then there's guidelines for the participation of advisors. Advisors are linked to board members, and so there is a question around how they can participate in certain meetings. But really the most important topic on the agenda next week is the startup phase of the fund. And there is, next slide, please. There is a proposal by the Secretariat that is online, so it's available for people to have a look. There have been some consultations before this meeting, both with board members and some highly flawed consultations with observers as well, which has led to this proposal. And so what are we talking about when we say a startup phase? It is really, as I mentioned before, this period this year and next year where the fund is supposed to start disbursing money based on a simplified operational model. And it is a testing and learning phase that will then guide the further development of the fund's long-term operations. But at the same time, it has also been very clearly said by the board that it's not supposed to set a precedent. However, we feel that this is really an important moment, as it will show what the actual vision is of this board, where we're going with this fund. I think I'll stop there on this slide and then go to the next two. I think the most important thing is, of course, what we want from this startup phase. And so what we think is really important is that this startup phase doesn't limit or isn't limited to one type of interventions in terms of scope. So we want this startup phase to be really comprehensive in terms of addressing both economic and non-economic losses, but also losses related to extreme weather events and slow onset events, and really looking at the broad range of loss and damage to make sure it doesn't limit the scope of the fund already before it started. And of course, it's really important to ensure also in this phase that there is participation, stakeholder and rights holder engagement to determine the modalities of this startup phase. Then we've determined some clear non-negotiables. We've been working on a submission that really fleshes out all of these things in more detail, but really 3 buckets, 3 non-negotiables that we need to see. And if we don't see it, that we really need to then we probably need to make a decision to strongly push back against actual disbursement of money, is firstly a strict do no harm approach. There is, an important role for policies like safeguarding policies, to safeguard against ecosystem harm, human rights harm. When those policies are not in place, of course, there is a risk of harm. And so the main demand that we've put forward is that this phase needs to be limited to low risk activities. I won't go into detail into what that means, but that's a really important demand. And also that in the meantime, the board will still use existing policies, safeguarding policies, to ensure that no harm can occur during this phase. And if harm occurs, that people who are harmed have access to justice. So that's one big bucket. The second is community access needs to be part of this startup phase. And unfortunately, in the proposal that the Secretariat has put forward, that is not the case. It's only coming in a later stage, potentially within the startup phase, if there is more capacity, but it's clear that they're not prioritizing it. So that's a really, really crucial one. And then there are demands for grants, of course, also comes into the startup phase. So the startup phase should be grants only. And the proposal there says it will prioritize grants. So that's going in a good direction, but probably we need to make it a little bit stronger on that front as well. So I think I'm well over time, so I'll stop there. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lien. And we're going to hear now from Brenda on what will happen at the high-level dialogue. Over to you, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Theo, and thank you so much, Lien and Harjeet, for walking us through the other sections. So I'll walk you through what will happen at the high-level dialogue. Next slide, Tel. So as per the decision at COP28, Annex 2, the fund is actually going to convene a high-level dialogue on coordination as well as complementarity in this year, of which it was officially launched during COP29 last November. And the first dialogue is actually going to be held on the 23rd of April, which is going to be on the margins of IMF and World Bank spring meetings in Washington, D.C. So the spring meetings are actually happening from the 21st to 24th of April. And what are the objectives of the high-level dialogue? Why should we have this? And why are we doing this? So firstly is actually just in summary is to exchange as an opportunity to exchange of relevant knowledge as well as information, and also to enhance the integration of measures to respond to loss and damage into sources, funds, processes, as well as initiatives. And also as an opportunity to exchange, as an exchange opportunity for country as well as community experiences in undertaking action to respond to loss and damage, and also to be able to identify priority gaps as well as new opportunities for cooperation, coordination, as well as complementarity. And lastly, to also develop recommendations on scaling up as well as enhancing existing, as well as initiating new funding arrangements for responding to loss and damage. Next slide. So what is the agenda? What's on the agenda? So as we are speaking right now, we do not have much information on the high-level dialogue apart from the concept note that was introduced or that was given out during the fourth board meeting that was last December. But however, according to Annex 2 of COP28 decision, we do know that the high-level dialogue participation in this is going to consist in like not more than 30 high-level representatives of entities that are like engaged in responding to loss and damage. And this is the list. I'm not going to go into detail of who and who because of time, but this is the list that we're anticipating for in this high-level dialogue. Next slide, Tel. So what do we want to see in this high-level dialogue, like the discussions that are going to be there? For us, we see this as an opportunity to set out a clear vision for how the fund will actually be able to reach the scale of finance that's needed, and also establish how the fund will play the central coordinating role in loss and damage funding arrangements, and how it will ensure coherent human rights and equity-based approaches to addressing loss and damage, and also to provide recommendations on enhancing coordination as well as complementarity across the loss and damage funding arrangements, including through the third review of OneSoul international mechanism for loss and damage, which is actually going to take place at COP30 after failing to come to a conclusion during COP29, and also to guide other loss and damage actors to ensure the complementarity and additionality of their efforts to the fund's central finance provision, including by making recommendations on a criteria of what we can be counted as loss and damage finance to ensure additionality to other climate finance like the adaptation finance. Next slide. And also, when it comes to participation in this meeting, because this is going to be annual meeting, so that means every year it's going to be there. So, what is it that we want to see when it comes to meaningful participation in this? So, to ensure that there's guaranteed meaningful participation to those invited representatives that are going to be there, first of all, we want to make sure, that there's translation as well as interpretation, considering that not everyone is an English native speaker. So we want to make sure that, and that does not mean like entail your level of expertise. So we want to make sure that everyone who is there, like there's translation as well as interpretation, to make sure that everyone is able to participate meaningfully. And also there should be a live webcast, because as highlighted, there's only going to be 30 high-level participants, which means not all of us are going to be there. And that shouldn't limit us from following the convening. So there should be a live webcast for us to be able to follow. And also timely sharing of documents. As already said, at this point, we don't know what's on the agenda and how is the convening going to be like. And also simplified accreditation for those that are going to be there. We don't want people to fail to participate after being invited, because the accreditation process is very complex. And also, they should also make sure that representatives that are being invited in there. So we are rooting for civil society representatives that are going to be there, to make sure that the intervention that are being made are actually on equal footing to other high-level participants. And also, those that are coming from developing countries, there should be financial support for travel as well as accommodation for them to be able to fully participate in this convening. That's all from me. I'll hand it over to Harjeet to take us through our call to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. I suggest all of us take a deep breath. It has been breathless from our side. Sorry, folks. We wanted to make sure that we cover a lot of ground. I do recognize it has been quite dense, and that's why we have shared the link to the presentation that's being made. And as Theo said in the beginning, there are a number of links to everything that Brenda, Lien, Theo, and I presented. So feel free to explore that later, not during the call right now. So we would like you to engage. What I'm going to do is to quickly talk about how you can engage. And I could see there are a number of questions coming on the chat. So, and I'll cover some part of it. But the idea is that we will spend the next 20+ minutes on having the conversation so you can ask questions. I'll now cover how you can get involved a bit more with this process. And I have been responding to some of the questions. You know that we are organized as part of the UN system. We are organized as 9 constituencies. And we also, some of us who, as Lien was presenting, talk a lot more about human rights and justice and how communities need to be centered. We call ourselves rights-based constituencies, and we work very closely with many others to make sure that our demands are taken on board. That's a role we play, and you should know that which constituency you should reach out to. So there is YOUNGO constituency, which is coordinated by Climate Action Network International and Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. So if you are an environmental NGO, you should reach out to them. We will try and elaborate that also. We'll actually expand that in the slide. I just realized after reading those questions, you should know that. If you are working on gender issues and women's rights, then you should reach out to Women and Gender constituency. If you are from the indigenous peoples communities, you should reach out to them, and they'll be able to get you more involved through the processes that they run. Then, of course, then there's YOUNGOs, and then there are other constituencies like farmers. We also have business, which we also have trade union. We also work very closely with them. So there's ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation. So what we will do, and again, as I said, we just realized we'll add those details here so that you can reach out to respective constituencies. We will also share the email IDs of their focal points. But over and above this group that organized this consultation, we also want to make sure that you get involved through some of these processes. So all the organizations here some are part of the constituencies, some are working independently as networks and as allies. So that's the role we are playing in addition to that. We have something called LDF Friends Group, which is a signal group, and we also have LDF CSO list. So you have got the link to this presentation, and I'll request Theo or Brenda to share the link to the form separately also on the chat. So I could see some of you sharing your email IDs. It will be very difficult for us to do it that way. I request you to fill up that form, and then we will see how we do that. And if you have to forward your details to a respective constituency, we'll do that. But we have a very simple screening process just to make sure that we are only including civil society. So that's why that form. So please enter your details on that form. And of course, we would like you to get a lot more engaged in funding and supporting the ongoing loss and damage work under the UNFCCC and beyond. We are going to, so number of things that Lien and Brenda said we are going to engage on at this board meeting and beyond. We already know the plan for this year. So one of the things that's going to get really, really important is the scale of money. So we would like to make sure that the money that has been pledged should be received. And as I said, we have not even got 300 million out of 760 that has been pledged. Of course, we need more contributions. So we are going to have a campaign jointly for you to engage with us so that we actually demand the scale of money that is commensurate to the needs on ground. We also started a process, you must have seen messages, emails, and social media posts from Loss and Damage Collaboration, where we came up with a form to collect case studies. And it's extremely important for us to share those with the board. And that's what we have been doing. And this is a great chance for us to influence. And then, of course, I know that there are some media friends on this call who should also join us in sharing our demands much more widely. Their role has been absolutely critical to the success of the fund so far in getting it established. Now we need to make sure that because it's not part of the formal UNFCCC process and those COP jamborees, and it happens in different settings, we should make sure that our media friends help us track it, and we will definitely coordinate with you and put those messages out to keep the pressure on. And your contribution is absolutely valuable. No contribution is too small. I'll stop here and I'll hand over back to Theo. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Harjeet, and to everyone who spoke. Now it's time for your questions. So please do raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, if you've not asked in the chat, and we'll field those questions between us. If you can please keep questions short, that would be brilliant, just so we can get through as many as possible. And I realize that, okay, please over to you, Satat.
Yes, thanks very much, Theo, Lien, Harjeet, everyone. I already typed my question in the chat box, but just to reiterate it, with the US's withdrawal from the board of the fund, what will happen to the vacant position? And do we have any intel? What do we see happening in terms of, we need more money, but with the US out, what are the prospects? Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Satat. Harjeet, Lien, or Brenda, would one of you like to field that one?
I can go and say that it's not super clear at this moment. So the conversation is happening because US had an independent seat without any alternate. So normally in such a process, alternate would take up that seat. I think the conversation is going to happen now at this board meeting, because the official letter, as you saw a couple of weeks ago, has just come. So the resignation from Rebecca, who has been on the board. So now they are going to discuss. There could be various possibilities, also looking at the ones who have contributed to the fund, who are not having a seat right now. And then there are going to be discussions whether that's going to be an independent seat like the US had, or the same system of having an alternate. So many of those questions are going to be discussed. I'm sure there is going to be a question whether the US contributed the money that they pledged before Trump taking over. They have. So $17.5 million that they pledged. So the previous administration made sure that that money was delivered to the fund. Of course, as you said, the US being the biggest and the largest contributor to emissions has the largest responsibility. So we would not like to see the US off the hook. But at this moment, we all understand the political situation, but we will keep the pressure on. Back to you, Theo.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. And over to you, Rachel. Please do ask a question.
Thanks. And thanks for the great presentations, everyone. I have two questions. Firstly, for Lien, I wondered if you could say a bit more about the non-negotiables and specifically the environmental social safeguards for the startup phase of the fund. Yeah, if you could just expand like what the proposal is currently looking like on these. And also, yeah, I mean, if the board falls short, then what's the kind of process for civil society redlining these, which I think you mentioned. And then also for Brenda, on the high level dialogue, I'm just wondering so the first one is in a couple of weeks. So but for this and future ones, where to take the asks on the high level dialogue, in terms of it being more inclusive and accessible? Is it something that the secretariats are going to manage, or will that be on a future board meeting agenda? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Over to you first, Lien.
Thanks, Rachel. So I think in terms of like the safeguards and the risks, there's basically we have three separate demands for the startup phase that are linked. Because the first one is that we want the startup phase to be linked to low risk activities, and the way we've defined that for now in our proposal is that that would be category C, I think, of Green Climate Fund activities. So the Green Climate Fund has this very elaborate economic and social safeguard policy where they categorize activities in risk scales, where you could say, for example, highest risk is like big infrastructure projects, hydro dams. That's of course in the context of the GCF, where in loss and damage context you could think of like very big reconstruction projects with infrastructure and things like that. And then low risk is more like community-based ecosystem management, capacity building, empowerment. Just a second, because I put on a coffee and it's making noise. 1 second.
Oh, Lien's back.
Apologies for that. So that's one demand, and basically we have aligned all of our other demands for the startup phase with that one, because our starting point is that there will be only low risk activities. And so what we're asking then is, in the absence of a full scale economic and social safeguarding policy, they should rely on appropriate internationally recognized standards that are aligned with this like low risk scale, small scale approach, which means, for example, looking at the safeguards of the adaptation fund. And then there is this third demand that is like, because we also know that there's not going to be an independent grievance redress mechanism ready by the time this money starts flowing out. So they need to clarify what the process is for communities that might face harm to seek justice under this startup phase in the absence of this dedicated mechanism. So that's the buckets of demands that we have. In terms of what is in the Secretariat proposal, they're proposing a blanket approach of basically accreditation of actors that have already accreditation under the Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund, and the CHEF. So that means that they have already, somehow the policies in place to apply the safeguards of these mechanisms. However, in the GCF, for example, there's a bunch of actors that we don't think are appropriate for the loss and damage fund, like big private sector actors, banks. So then that's where another demand of ours comes in, is that there's no blanket approval of all of these actors. There is some sort of prioritization, and also an outreach to new actors, community-based actors that might not yet be under those mechanisms. It needs to be really with a community focus, this startup phase. So having the processes in place to have new actors, and then again, those new actors would have to apply to this safeguards that are aligned with the low risk mechanism. I know there's a lot of levels in there, but in conclusion, I think it's not that they're proposing to not have anything in place in terms of safeguards, but there's nothing in terms of risk mitigations for the projects at this point, I think, in the proposal of the Secretariat, and I think that would be our starting point. So that's really what we're asking. In terms of how we deal with when they are going to be deciding or proposing things that are not aligned or are non-negotiables, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I called them red lines. We don't have a big proposal or how to deal with that, but that's really that's going to be the benchmark that we hold to decide whether we think it's a good or a bad proposal, and so whether civil society should push back or can go ahead with whatever they are proposing as a decision. I hope that was an answer to your question. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll see the space for other questions now.
Thank you so much, Lien, and thank you for that question, Rachel. So, Brenda, over to you on the high-level dialogue question. And just to say, Harjeet has said he can also come in as well as needed.
Awesome. Thanks, Theo, and thanks, Rachel, for that question. So if you look into the COP28 decision, it only emphasizes on who are going to represent, like, in person right there, but it doesn't say it's going to be a closed session whereby we cannot live stream like the session, right? We understand we cannot be there like in person. So for me, I see that as an opportunity where it's being convened by the fund as well as the UN Secretary General. So I feel like our messages really can target the fund. So who is making the composition of the fund is the secretariat, is the board. So I think it's high time where we can call upon the board members as well as the secretary, the board secretariat, to actually provide a platform where we can stream, like live stream, like the way we do with the board meetings. There's the live streaming options where we follow through all the discussions in there. So that also, I feel like it's a very big opportunity for us to really call upon them to say we want to make sure that there's like proper meaningful participation, because we want to be there and we want to be able to follow through these discussions, and the decision doesn't say it's going to be closed and won't be streamed out there. So I think this is the right time to even call upon them, and the board meeting is happening next week, and we can also reinforce on them to actually provide us a platform where we can be able to, like, you know, live stream the high level dialogue. Harjeet, do you have anything that you might want to add on that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's what should be our focus, and to also respond to some of the specifics. Of course, a lot of details are going to be out, as you asked, Rachel. And that's why, as Brenda said, the next board meeting is important. And it's quite strange that we knew about this meeting long ago, and the date has also been moving. And we're hearing it's now 25th of April, first half. Barely any days left, and imagine holding that meeting in the US, and we all know what's happening in the US right now with people being deported and sent back. So visa remains a massive issue. Clearly, at this high-level dialogue, we are not going to see many people out of the US unless, even if they have visas, getting funding and getting even passed through the immigration is now seen as a challenge. So the other issues that we are definitely going to raise in terms of participation, as Brenda has been mentioning. Yes, it's very likely that all the meetings from now on are going to happen in other parts of the world to make them more accessible, and that's where the secretariat is going to play a bigger role, because the secretariat has only been set up now, and they've also been scrambling with little capacity. And of course, this has been tied with the spring meetings of the World Bank. That's why it's happening in the US. But going forward, these should be linked, and we will also put pressure to make sure that there is effective participation. And apart from live streaming that we require, we also would like to encourage and demand remote participation so that we are able to speak up. We are hearing that they are going to allow 2 to 3 observers, but at such a short notice and with US visa issues, that's not going to be practically possible to be there in person. So remote participation must be enabled for our meaningful participation.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. I think just to add very briefly, we saw at the launch of the high-level dialogue at COP29, none of these things were in place, very short notice periods, even though it was happening during a COP. So we do have a precedent, unfortunately. Isabel, over to you for your question.
Sorry, thank you all. And yeah, thanks for the very helpful updates. I just a sort of practical question on the high-level dialogue. So I'm going to be in Washington, DC that week. I understand that it's kind of a very closed-door event, but do you think there's any way of somehow engaging? Would there be any sort of more open session, like any way to sort of get a preliminary readout on what was discussed, you know. So yeah, thoughts on that would be welcome. And then just to mention, as many know on the call, that I've been coordinating on behalf of Give Directly and the CALP network a complementary contribution to the LDF CSO group's contribution, specifically on the use of cash transfers as part of the startup phase of the fund, both as a modality within direct access mechanisms as well as for community access. And I'll share a link to the final version of that in this chat just for reference. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Perhaps we can go back to Harjeet, who I believe will be on the ground in Washington, to suggest any possible ways to engage.
Yeah, probably not this time. I may not be there in person, but we are going to be tracking online. And of course, that's why we are going to demand that kind of access. So, Isabel, details are still unfolding. As I said, even date change was happening like just a few days ago. So things are super unclear, and that's the point we would like to make at the board meeting. Some of us are going to be in Barbados for that. So we will definitely raise that point and share the opportunities that can be created for observers. And the challenge is going to be, when we say observers, again, as I've been saying, there are 9 constituencies, how we are going to coordinate among ourselves, who's going to be selected, who's going to represent that constituency or a cluster of constituencies. We are also going to have that time challenge to identify who's going to represent, whether it's going to be an online participation or in person. But it's going to be up to constituencies to decide, but we'll be very happy to share those details with you as things get clearer.
Thank you so much, Harjeet, and over to Lorenzo for your question, please.
Thank you, Theo. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the update. Perhaps this partly overlaps already with something that has been addressed by Lien, but just in terms of the direct access window or mechanism, what is your vision in terms of how that should work? What do you think it's feasible at this stage based on what you know of how these discussions have been progressing? Yeah, do you have something specific in mind? How far does your red line go, etc.? Thank you.
Just before I answer, to clarify, is that within the startup phase or more generally that you're asking?
Perhaps both, if you see that will be massively different once we get into a more definitive setup. Over.
Yeah, I think so. For the longer term, we're really thinking of, well, having all the modalities in place to have like accessible modalities basically in all of the sort of the type of activities that the fund does, and having this dedicated mechanism and the idea of that dedicated mechanism. And I saw a lot of questions in the chat actually around like how can we access, how can community based organizations engage, and the idea of having a dedicated mechanism would really be that there's a lot of thinking around like how to again have these accessible modalities, but also building capacity at different levels to ensure that actors know how to access the fund and have the information to access the resources, including for example having documents available in a variety of languages, local languages as well. So really having this mechanism in place to think through the modalities, and then also at the same time having a sort of minimum allocation floor for community access. So there is a dedicated stream of money that is going to community access through the different modalities. So that's I think the long-term vision. For the startup phase, I think that dedicated mechanism, we also have to be like a little bit realistic, will probably not be in place or not as in the way that we want it. So I think in the startup phase, it's really about ensuring that new actors can come on board, community-based actors that also, again, like the modalities to become a new implementing actor, even in the startup phase, are designed in such a way that community-based organizations can apply and be accredited, but also, again, doing active outreach to identify those organizations in certain contexts. And then also this minimum allocation floor, because even in the startup phase, there's going to be a discussion on like minimum allocation in terms of geographical regions. And so there we're also asking for having a minimum allocation floor of resources that will go to community access directly. While right now we don't see that in the proposal at all. So that's really something to push for. I hope that answered your question. Also happy to take it offline for more conversation if you want.
I can just add a line to what Lien said. I think we need to look at community access from an overarching perspective. So as Lien said, this window, small grant that we are demanding, but then it's also about integration. Any activity that's happening, whether it's part of direct budgetary support or programmatic support, have to make sure that communities are able to access that. And that's why this accreditation process and their involvement at the local and national levels is going to be absolutely fundamental. So we are looking at it as a principle, as an approach, and as a mechanism, mechanism not with M capital, but a way so that communities are able to access.
Thank you very much, Harjeet and Lien. We have a question from Jasmima. Over to you. Are you able to unmute and ask your question, Jasmima?
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Hello everyone, I'm Jasmine Savatin. I'm from YOUNGO's Loss and Damage Contact Fund. So my question is actually, how will the loss and damage fund differentiate between adaptation and loss and damage when allocating the resources, and what actually the criteria will be used in the access the financial needs to affect most affected communities? And as a youth representative, how can YOUNGO play a more central role in decision-making processes for the loss and damage fund in 2005, ensuring that youth voices also meaningfully integrate?
Thank you so much for that question. Is there anyone who would like to answer that one?
Okay, I can come in and Lien, Brenda, feel free to chip in. Just to clarify, Jasmina, this is a loss and damage fund, and within loss and damage, there has been a long debate on averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And averting, minimizing actually covers mitigation and adaptation. We would not like this fund to fund adaptation and only go for loss and damage, and that too, the addressing part of it. And even within that, much more focus on rehabilitation and reconstruction or relocation in some cases. So we would like this fund to prioritize that and not really, again, going back to the debate whether it's adaptation or loss and damage. I think the world clearly knows what loss and damage is, and it took us 30 long years to come to this point. So we don't want any confusion. And on your point on youth participations, of course, you have YOUNGO's constituency, and there are many opportunities. And with the observer policy, we are going to make sure that it's all institutionalized. So continue working with the YOUNGO constituency. And of course, we as allies are pushing for everybody's equitable participation.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. Over to you, Lien.
Just on the youth participation thing, I wanted to add maybe a point on like the decision on observer accreditation. That is, well, there was a decision to have a blanket approach, but then there's going to be modalities in place for observers to come to the meetings, even if they're not active observers. And to my understanding, that's not going to be, well, in the Green Climate Fund, that is not linked to the constituencies. So just wanted to flag that there is also a way to participate, or there will be a way to participate in the meetings without explicitly being the active observer. You can, your organization can get accredited. So that's really an important one. And also, and I mean, that goes back to what Harjeet was saying before, like there's also ways to participate and to have an impact and to, to influence the work without, going to the meetings, being very much into the technical details, following all of the work. And I think that's really, I mean, that's the call to action that Harjeet was making, like every contribution counts. And if you can just join, for example, the coalition meetings, or just have a look at draft submissions to make sure that, youth priorities are reflected for other organizations, that will be other things. And just really making sure that the work that the coalition is doing is building on the breadth of expertise that we have in this network, even without having people, you know, travel all over the world several times a year to go to these board meetings, will be super, super helpful. So any way you can contribute also to this work would be super useful. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lien, and that's a nice call to action to end on, as we've now reached time. However, I will just give all of you a chance to raise anything important before we do finish. Is there anything else you'd like to add which we've missed? Excellent. I'll take that silence as a no. Well, thank you so much for everyone who participated today. Please do access the slides which have been shared in the chat. We will be sending out the resources after this session and the session later on today as well. Thank you so much for joining us.